Good day, everyone. You found yourself in the token binding work group. If you believe that you have boarded the wrong working group meeting, please make your way to the exit now. The blue sheets are being circulated. Everyone should sign them. And up on the screen, we have the note well, please note it well. And we have an agenda. So we're proposing to go over the workgroup last call issues, review the token bound TLS 1.3 draft on the 0 RTT, look at the reverse proxies draft, and spend no time on the attestation draft other than to remind you that it does exist and you should read it. So let's get started with the last call issues, unless there's somebody that wants to add something to the agenda. Hearing none, let's proceed.
So the way we thought we'd do this is to get the people who have been active contributors to these discussions to take an active part today and see if we can work out as much as possible of these issues. There are no slides for the core documents for good reason. We don't have a lot of stuff to cover other than this face-to-face discussion. These are the issues that chairs could sort of glean from the discussion. That may not be a complete list. I'm sort of assuming that it's not going to turn out to be a complete list, but it's a starting point. There's been like two main sets of issues other than the editorial issues, and the editorial stuff we propose not to cover at all. We can deal with that on the list and deal with it as normal last call issues. There's been sort of two main sort of sets of issues. One of them has to do with security considerations. There hasn't been a lot of support for sort of making the change that Denise proposed around how to sort of essentially a terminology issue around security considerations, and we propose to actually leave it as is, so make no change to the document. And that leaves Martin Thompson's review, and I think Martin gets up to the microphone at exactly the right time.
So Martin Thompson, I put these on the list because I know they've been discussed.
Yeah.
We've already dealt with them. I didn't expect you to raise them in this room. The third one was new though.
And that's the last one. Yes.
Yes.
Exactly. And whether if some of these don't need any more discussion, that's fine. But we want to put them up here so everybody can get a sort of a final go at them.
Hi, Eric Riscola speaking, is about to be the person who has to approve this document. So with respect to Denise's point, it'd be great if the chairs could run through the process carefully so that you can tell me that there's consensus not to do this, and then you've considered it, rather than just sort of leave it pass in silence, because that way
All right, that's a fair point. We actually did ask a question on the list whether there was support for making the change, and there wasn't. Right?
Would you be willing to hum in the room?
We can absolutely sort of wrap that up with a hum in the room. So I'd like to ask the question whether for anybody who supports making the change of terminology suggested by Denise, to please hum now. And for anybody who thinks we should leave the text as is, to please hum now. All right, to me that sounds like pretty clear consensus. And since we sort of pre-confirmed this on the list, I think we'll sort of call this right now. All right, thank you, Eric. And I guess the floor is open. Please settle these issues now. This is why we're here, with physical presence.
Okay, let's start off with the first issue, people. Is there anybody who wants to make the argument that the TLS extensions aren't justified?
Well, I did
Okay.
So in that case, we can just sort of do the same hum around these issues. Would you think that's? Would you like us to do that, Martin? Okay. Do you want to? Okay. So, so the question is, should we? I think the question is, should we leave the text as is, or propose a change or work towards a change, eliminating the use of TLS extensions, right? So, if you believe that the text is good enough as is, now, right? If you believe that work should be put into the draft to eliminate towards eliminating TLS extensions, now, right? And the third question, if you don't if this doesn't make sense, if the question doesn't make sense to you, or if you need more information to answer this question, please now. All right, that seems like pretty clear consensus to leave the text as is. Do you want to add?
No. Maybe we can get some takers on the last one, which is, I guess, the most recent one to come up. And that is the signatures on referred token bindings. Do we need them as we currently have in the spec? Or should we drop them for some sense of simplicity? Does anybody want to talk? Well, do any of the current authors want to give us a brief explanation of why it was thought to be important to sign both the provided and the referred token binding? In the pink box, please.
Hi, I'm Dirk. I'm in the pink box. So the idea was, so the referred and provided token bindings are there in a situation where the client is basically asked to go to an identity provider, and the identity provider then issues a some sort of assertion or identity token or something like that. That the client is then supposed to hand to a relying party, and the identity token assertion is supposed to be bound to a key that the client controls, and the key is presumably something that the client doesn't normally use with the identity provider, because the client will use different keys for different websites. So normally the identity provider wouldn't know what the key pair is that the client uses with the relying party. But there are provisions in the spec that sort of make exceptions to this rule and allow the client to show the key pair that it's normally using with the relying party to the identity provider and say, here, this is the key pair that I'm using with the relying party. Can you please mint me a credential that is bound to that key pair, because I'm going to use it with the relying party. And presumably it's doing that while strongly authenticating to the identity provider, while sending a cookie or a roll-off token or something to the identity provider, saying, hi, I'm the client that you already know. I want you to mint me a credential for this other site that I'm about to go to for the relying party. And to strongly authenticate to the identity provider, there's the provided token binding in there, where the client can say, look, I'm the client that you already know. Here's proof that I'm in possession of this key pair, and here's also my cookie that is bound to that key, so you know who I am. Can you now please mint me this credential that I'm going to use with the relying party? And to get to the sort of an equivalent level of security between the client and the relying party, we wanted to make sure that at that point, we can be sure that the client really is in possession of that key pair, because it's going to be a different key pair from the one that the client uses to authenticate to the identity provider. And in particular, if you think about scenarios like web browsers or something, clients can sometimes be tricked to send stuff to servers that they don't necessarily have much control about, with redirects and so forth. while we have lots of provisions in place in the spec, prefixing the header with SEC dash and so forth to try to make that impossible, we don't always know exactly what kind of environment the token mining will be deployed in, whether it's really going to be a web browser, whether it's really going to be an SEC prefixed header and so forth. So to make sure that clients can't be tricked into sending, mentioning a key that they don't really control in this message, we thought it would be prudent to, at this particular layer, also make the client actually proof that they possess this key. So we don't have to worry about other mechanisms sitting on top that try to prevent the same thing from happening.
Pretty good explanation.
So Martin Thompson, I think that's the why that I was looking for. But there's another design that achieves the same goal with only one signature, and that is you use the key that you have, that you're using with that site, that the token binding you're using with that site, and you include under a signature on that key the referred token binding ID. That would achieve the same goal, right?
So we used to have an earlier design where the keys would sort of cross-certify each other. Is that
No,
sort of
I remember that. Yeah. But there's no. The attack that you're looking to avoid is whether the client is effectively duped into performing what's effectively an unknown key share, where it says, please bind the following key that the client doesn't control to this. And as long as the client is the one generating this message, and we can guarantee that, then you can do that with a single signature, which is you have a referred token binding, which is a token binding for the token binding ID of the client that it's using with this origin, which includes the same signature also covers the token binding ID for the other origin, and you have a single signature.
Right. If you can be sure that the client can't be tricked into
the same applies here. Yeah. Well, presumably the client would know that it's doing this, and have the referred token binding does exactly this, right? So when you have the referred token binding header in the redirect, you're effectively tricking the client into sending this information. Mm-hmm. So it's all automated. It's entirely possible.
So there is a security difference between the two.
Yes.
In that the way that we have it now, you can't trick the client into signing a token binding that it doesn't actually have the private key for, because it doesn't have the private key for it. In your proposal,
right.
It's similar, but in principle, if you could trick the client into signing provided data, then it would be the server that receives the provided token binding wouldn't be able to tell the difference.
Yeah, I find that relatively convincing, and I'm kind of willing to step back on this one. But I would ask that you write down that, because that's not in the draft at the moment. There's a long explanation of why you have this, and the conclusion from that is that you don't need the signature, right? The actual text that goes through, and there's quite a lengthy section explaining why you have the two things and the referring and the attack, that the particular attack that you're talking about. But my conclusion from reading that was that you don't need the signature. And you have to describe this other attack that you're talking about, which is where the client is duped some way into signing something that it doesn't own.
So does somebody else want to put the counter position? Because otherwise I can make a couple of other points sort of in favor of Martin's argument. Even though I don't personally agree with it, we may as well at least get them out on the table. Sure. People will bring them up later. So the problem that we have with the two signatures, the current state is that there is an edge case where the relying party uses different crypto algorithms that aren't understood by the server. So in principle, you could have a referred token binding. The browser supports both algorithms, and the server supports algorithm A, client supports algorithm B, and the server won't be able to actually understand that referred token binding. That wouldn't happen under the case of Martin's one signature over both token binding IDs. But on the other hand, the argument is that if you actually are doing federation between two parties, actually coordinating what algorithms you're supporting isn't actually the end of the world. So where having two signatures creates some additional deployment complexity because you could have algorithm mismatches is really the most compelling argument for not signing the second one or signing it with the same key.
So Andrei Popov, Microsoft. My argument against this is that in practice, if you have RPs and IDPs, then it is reasonable to expect that IDPs, that IDP and his RPs, that relate to him actually have a communication channel between them, and that they actually, coordinate deployment of the token binding parameters. I think that's a reasonable thing to expect from them. And my other argument against eliminating the signature on the referred bindings is that, today when we look at the actual redirect mechanism that we currently define, we can maybe convince ourselves that there is no way to dupe the client into sending a referred binding to a key that the client does not control. But from the protocol perspective, I would like the token binding implementation to be independent of the details of the federation mechanism. So so when we have new federation mechanism in the future, we don't have to to go back and validate that again the client cannot be duped into sending a referred binding that the client does not support.
Ben Kaduk, I just want to second Martin and say, please add some text to the document that says making the client actually produce the signature means that it's not going to sign something with a key it doesn't have.
So do the authors have any particular objection to adding such explanation, given that you probably thought it was self-evident? Okay, the issue is already filed.
Hi, I'm Daryl Piper, sort of from DEC. I think I'm following a Microsoft guy, I was told. This sounds, you can tell a lot about working groups by the kind of languages they use, the domain-specific languages they're inventing. The terms they feel a need to redefine, for example, tells you a lot. I'm hearing language that sounds a lot like the language that was used once upon a time in GSS API to bind tokens securely with things like cryptographic algorithm independent protocols and assertions into the API about what levels of protection you want these bound tokens to carry. And I brought up Microsoft because I know they have it. And I know I used it in their IKE to authenticate, cross-realm authenticate domain controllers for NT5. And I'm just wondering why this working group seems to be reinventing the wheel. And I was told that, I was cautioned that I might piss people off, and that's certainly not my intent here. This room is obviously kind of full of people writing drafts, which I love to see. I just, at some level, don't understand what's being done here. And I hope someone can explain it.
I'll just take a stab at saying that I think this is more about, there's a cultural, there's a certain level of cultural inheritance from channel bindings that used to be called to this, rather than duplication of ethics.
Ben Kaduk again, just a clarifying question about the previous comment. So when you're talking about the GSS API and the quality protection, are you actually explicitly talking about the GSS quality protection values that have mostly been deprecated in the current usage, or are you talking about something else?
Well, first off, I should admit I'm over in my head here. I haven't been to an IETF in 10 years. I've been retired. I'm just here. I don't know what's happened to GSS API and Kitten. I haven't been following them either. I will start following them.
All right. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that. Again, as I said, I don't think there's duplication of effort. I think there's more sort of, yes, that's the word I'm looking for.
Okay, good. Good answer. I like it. But it seems like, well, be nice. You're violating the golden rule of trusted systems design. Keep the TCB small and simple so that you can understand it.
Right, and it turns out that people haven't been or there hasn't been a lot of support for implementing GSS API for the HTTP layer, unfortunately, or fortunately.
Well, but the general desire by anyone, all of you guys who think everything should run in user mode in the browser seems misdirected.
Possibly, but that's premise of this working group is to solve problems within the scope of what the platforms we actually have, right?
So I guess what I'm trying to say is by just inventing yet another protocol, yet another way to do it, yet another thing, we've made it very confusing for people to go to the Chinese menu and figure out how to build secure systems. So when you just do another one, assuming you get it right and it's secure, it's just confusing.
So, this is an interesting discussion. It might be, probably would have been more valuable during both when this working group was formed than when we're almost done.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
So, Martin, did you want to say anything about the ETLD+1 issue, or is that another? Okay, so I'm just going to do a pro forma hum on that. Just make sure that nobody else sort of thinks that actually that is really important. So Martin's comment was, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, that it seems like a problem that we're baking ETLD+1 into the HTTP spec, and the question is whether the working group should actually try to eliminate that dependency from the specification. So I'm just going to ask for a hum of people who believe Martin is correct and we should actually try to work towards eliminating a dependency on ETLD+1 in the specifications. Please hum now. All right.
Stephen Farrell, about to be your ex-ID. Was there a proposal for some other thing, or is this just a question about whether we should search for one?
Right, exactly. There was no proposal.
So Martin Thompson, I think I suggested that you could bind these to an origin, scope to an origin, which is scheme, host, port.
So the appropriate hum would be to ask for support for moving towards scoping to origin rather than scoping to ETLA.
That'd be a reasonable question to ask. Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, so rephrase. So if you believe that Martin...
I'm not sure that everybody in the room actually understands. So we should find out whether or not people actually understand what the two options mean before we...
Well, I think one option that I was going to hum for is sort of leave the text as is, right? And the other is, work towards origin scoping rather than ETLD+1 scope.
Hi, Jeff Hodges. So this is in regards to the HTTPS token binding spec.
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct.
I wanted to get that in the record.
Yeah.
Okay. What does the spec say now? The spec says now that you should, I believe, scope your token binding keys to ETLD+1 in order to match the binding, the scoping of cookies, which is by default, and it references RFC 6562. Yeah, 6265, I get that backwards.
Just a slight clarification, Andrei Popov, Microsoft. There are two levels of things that the specs say. The protocol spec says that the token binding keys should be scoped no larger than the scope of the tokens in the application protocol. And then the HTTPS token binding spec says that the scope is ETLD+1.
Right. And my understanding of your question/proposal, Martin, is that you suggested this be moved to scoping at origin instead of ETLD+1. Is that correct? Yeah, I see Martin nod.
Just to be a little bit clear, the current text is slightly more complicated in that it has one case that must be ETLD+1, and then there's another case that should be ETLD+1. So it's for key pairs for first-party and federation use cases defined in this specification and used for binding HTTP cookies is must. And then if you want to bind other things like OAuth tokens or OpenID Connect ID tokens, that's the should.
So Martin Thompson, since you have the text in front of you, Ben, does that allow you to go wider in scope? Or does it say that you might want to, that's the, I mean, a should there suggests that you could choose to ignore that rule and do something else, in which case, does that mean that you could do wider scope tokens? Or can I give the same ID to every single site on the internet? So that's permitted by the spec. Okay, that's a no from me. So what I'm looking for is a maximum size of scope to be very clearly delineated. I understand that before, when we discussed this, the working group had consensus that it would be ETLD+1 as a maximum. And if we're not there now, we should at least fix that.
Brian Campbell Peng. So the ETLD+1 is a must maximum for web browsers. It's come up a few times on the list. The wording is very confusing, but the intent, as I understand it, is that a broader scoping is permitted for other applications which use HTTPS, such as OAuth. Although how that shakes out is still a little unclear. That's the intent to allow that. The text could maybe be improved.
Yeah, there's actually another part that I didn't read, which says that applications other than web browsers may use different key pair scoping rules. Sorry about that.
That's a part browser. Yeah. But the intent, and I do think the text is pretty clear about this, is that for web browsers, standard web browsers, it's ETLD+1, period. It can never go broader than that. And certainly that's how it's been implemented, I think.
Andrei Popov, Microsoft, just confirming that this is indeed the case. So originally we were going to say it's must, this is the scope and you cannot be broader than that. And then the point was brought up that in some application domains, there is inherent knowledge in the client of certain domains. Actually, the unlinkability problem does not apply in some domains, basically. That's why we kind of made it a should.
Yeah.
Hi, Jeff Hodges. One could argue that we may want to document design rationale on this point.
So, Martin, let me ask you this: do you believe that there is language to be clarified such that your sort of issue effectively disappears, or is there some way for you to sort of formulate your issue in the context that it's discussed, this discussion in a concept?
So Martin Thompson, the reason I raise this issue is it's an architectural one. We are continuing to build things on top of cookies that are terrible. I mean, cookies are terrible, and now this is another thing that will span origins, undermine the origin isolation that we have, allow for all sorts of interesting corner cases, and we have to continue to maintain things like the public suffix list and all those sorts of other mechanisms that we use to actually determine what ETLD+1 actually is. Very poorly defined, by the way, and very hard to. It's a huge maintenance hazard. So my preference would be that all new specifications actually used origin, because we actually understand what that means. It aligns with the security boundaries in the web, and it's pretty straightforward. But I understand that we have cookies here, and we actually want to protect cookies. So I appreciate the position that people have taken on this one. It's just that I wanted to make sure that we had a discussion about it, and we had a discussion about it. And I think that's
I mean,
the working group has consensus, so that's fine.
One possible outcome of this is actually clarify some language.
If
there is rationale language, that could be.
I think that actually doing as Jeff suggested and saying, we're doing this, we understand that it's bad, but it's necessary to protect cookies because cookies are bad, and maybe this will make cookies somewhat less bad, is probably something that would be reasonable to put in a document and fix the should at the same time.
Can I suggest that you, Jeff and you, Martin, that you sort of you go off in a huddle and come back with a pull request against the suitable spec to
It'll be the HTTPS spec.
Yeah.
Very, very clearly. I mean, the core specification is very precise on this one. And what Andre said earlier is fine. It was the HTTPS spec that needs the small tweak.
So just to clarify, the non-browser use of token binding with HTTPS, where you're binding it to a token which is used across multiple endpoints.
In the case where you're using HTTPS and you're driving it through an API and you're not operating inside a web browser and you understand who you're talking to and you want to maintain some sort of consistent identity because you have a token that's shared across a disparate set of servers, then fine, do whatever you want to do. And I think the specification is pretty clear on that one.
Okay, so
it retain the may that Brian was talking about, and then it's fine.
Right. So you're not objecting to that should, but you want to make sure that in the web browser case, that the scoping is no broader than ETLD+1.
Right.
Right. So I think that we're all clear on that. So
Yeah.
just
And properly explained, I think that is the reason, because I think one of the things that browsers may ultimately do here is play with the scoping rules of cookies, and understanding that the scoping rules here are meant to align with the scoping rules of cookies means that when they play with cookies, they should also be playing with the scoping rules of these tokens.
So ideally, if you scope a cookie more narrowly, the token binding ought to be scoped as narrowly.
And it so happens that we do these sorts of things on a regular basis now, and so understanding that would be very helpful.
Right. So I don't think that's controversial.
It's very helpful, thank you. With that, I think we actually paused through what we identified as the list of issues. Just before you, why do you get to the mic? I just want to ask if anybody has sort of identified anything else in the last core review that you believe we haven't covered, other than editorial issues?
Yeah, raised it a little while ago about the ramifications of allowing for longer EKM values, which generated a little bit of discussion that felt like maybe it was tending towards, no, let's go back to just having a fixed 32-byte EKM that's signed over all the time, but kind of, it sort of trailed off and wasn't, didn't come to any clear consensus that I was aware of. So I'd love to get to an answer one way or the other on that.
Andre Pavov, Microsoft. So I would just like to try to explain the issue again of EKM, right, and the history of that. So originally in our token binding spec, we said that the EKM will always be 32 bytes for token binding protocol version 1. You know, once you have a new version, you could have a different EKM, but basically it was fixed. Then an argument was brought up in this working group saying that, you know, why don't we make the length of the EKM dependent on the type of the token binding key, right? So if you add a new algorithm, a new signature algorithm, for example, a new signature scheme, then you can use an EKM of a different length. That was the argument. And we did that. We said that, for the currently defined token binding key types, we will be using 32-byte EKMs. In the future, this may change with a new definition of a token binding key type. Now, it is a valid point that this creates issues, for example, when there's a TLS terminator, which basically forwards the token binding message and the EKM to some backend server for verification. In this case, without the TLS terminator knowing all the possible token binding key types, they don't necessarily have the ability to generate all the necessary EKMs to be forwarded to the backend server for verification. So there's this little bit of a corner case, but it's an interesting kind of issue to discuss. And in principle, our choices are to go back to saying, with token binding 1.0, you always have a 32-byte EKM, and if you want something else, then you need a new token binding version. Or we can say that, for example, the TLS terminator is going to generate EKMs of various lengths and put them all in that message that is getting forwarded to the backend server for verification. So.
So I apologize for having missed the conversation earlier, but why would you want a longer EKM for some other signature scheme?
More bits, basically. But the argument was that the signature schemes defined now have a strength that's somewhat equivalent to being able to sign over 32 bits, and that there might be one in the future that, in order to bytes, not bits, they're practically the same, right? There might be a signature scheme defined as a key parameter type in the future that needs a longer input into this, what's being signed over, in order to achieve its full strength. And I was actually the one that made the argument in Seoul, although there was less of an argument and more of a, should we maybe consider this? And I think, sort of practically speaking, there aren't algorithms known or likely to be adopted here that require that.
I think the discussion on the list was that the next round of algorithms would be perfectly well matched with the 32-byte.
Yeah, that's a more accurate description.
At some point beyond the next round of algorithms, you might hypothetically want a larger EKM, but that seemed in the discussion on the list to be a fair hypothetical.
Extremely hypothetical, yeah.
Yeah, I'm skeptical at that point. It's worth noting that, at least in TLS, the underlying entropy is tied to the strength of the hash function, which you're using for HKDF. So unless you're also using SHA-384, you have 32 bits, 30 bytes, whatever. I'm unaware of any reason why you need to go larger than that. And if you did, you have to tie it to a bigger function, which tells you that the maximum is 48 octets for current versions of TLS. It is tied to the cipher suite, but the largest cipher suite you currently defined has SHA-384, so that's the biggest possible entropy block you have. And of course, you also have to be using what I guess. To match the security level. I mean, dude, the problem is that that you have to be using. I mean, no, you'd be using curve P 900 or something, because 521 is effectively 256 bits of strength, right? So
as I said, the next round of algorithms is appropriately matched to the.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of any situation where you actually have more than 256 bits of strength floating around here.
So I mean, by the time we actually have to worry about that, it's the quantum cryptography that will have already bitten us in the ass, in all likelihood.
So Martin Thompson, I have a suggestion here. Eka mentioned it. We can make the EKM as long as the output of the hash function that's the TLS PRF hash. And you avoid the problem. If you have the entropy, then you get the entropy that you have. And if you don't have the entropy, then you don't get very much more entropy. And then you're in the situation where you want to go to P 1342, which is an awesome prime, by the way, because I just made it up. Then you have to pick a cipher suite that is actually, the best prime, unlike to the 521 -1. you have to pick a cipher suite that matches the strength of the thing that you're looking for, and then we have a hopefully forward safe way of dealing with this one, and then we can sort of just not worry about having to issue a new version in that circumstance, hopefully.
That's actually not an implausibly bad idea. But, yeah.
Not an implausibly bad idea.
That's
sounds like the best endorsement for any of my ideas ever.
Yes.
Adam Langley, Google. So the TLS terminator is now forwarding on the cipher suite it used to the back end, so it knows.
Just the size. It forwards an EKM and the size of the EKM.
Fair enough.
So does anyone want to express what the consequences of this potentially breaking change would be?
So to be clear, the consequence of this change for people who are negotiating AES GCM with SHA-256 is nothing. And for those people who happen to be using AES 256 with the SHA-384s, and I think that's probably one of the only cipher suites that we actually have that's got the wider hash, those people would be affected. They would be using a larger EKM, and so it would be incompatible. So if people are routinely negotiating those things, it would break. That is a problem that may need I don't know what you want to do about it, but I mean, you could pick a new extension number.
Andrei Babov, Microsoft. So this does not sound like a bad idea. There are a few.
My thought exactly.
There are a few potential implications from this, right? So one implication is it would mean that the token binding protocol specification has this, it means that, whoever implements this, if we did this change, right, whoever implements needs to figure out what cipher suite was negotiated, right, and request an EKM of that length. So that's an extra kind of question for the TLS layer. I think that most TLS implementations support this, so it can be done in principle. Another thing is that, yeah, I guess we could do it. I think it's a possible solution. Yeah.
Just a process thing. The chairs sort of did a quick huddle here, and we both feel that if we do this, it's sort of it's more than just clarification and an editorial, and that would probably require us to do a quick but still another working group loss call. Just make sure everybody thinks it's worth it, because we'd really. Yeah, absolutely. We can do a 1 week working group last call, but still, we're gonna do that.
We don't intend to just rocket through with the change and not actually give the appropriate notification to people.
Ben Kaduk, just noting that this idea generally seems reasonable as we bring it up right now in the abstract, and the only concern I would have that's not obvious right in the room is just, as Andre was sort of talking about, how is the plumbing going to work to actually get the information to where it needs to be. So hopefully someone will think about that harder in the next day or two.
If Adam is on the queue, and after that, I'm just gonna.
Oh, I just wanted to stand up and say I think it's a bad idea, because someone should stand up and say it's excess complexity for no particular reason. Because 256 bits, even if you're worried about collisions, like 128 bits, 2 to the 128 different connections necessary to generate a collision in this space. I would say keep it simple.
For what it's worth, I agree with Adam. I mean, I'm not going to pitch a fit here, but I agree with Adam.
Second or third that agreement.
Andrei Popov, Microsoft. I also think it would be easier to just go back to saying 32 bytes and and that's it.
Or I guess the other thing would be to keep it the way it is, but just tell new algorithms to keep using 32 bits, and then we're. You can have whatever outcome you want, but it's a 32-bit EKM.
Right. So I think we should do a few hums here. Let's see if do a straw man hum list, and then people can complain about that, and then we can do the actual hum. So the one question would be if you support going back to 32-bit EKMs right now, right? That's one change. The other change
32-bit EKMs for this version.
for this version, absolutely. We're not committing any future versions of the protocol, right, to anything. Right? You're allowed to change IETF specs with the the right amount of arguing. So the other approach would be to make no change and clarify that if you actually ran into this problem, you would have to change the spec. That's another option. And the third option is to make it the size of the hash function, and sort of that's a breaking change, but that's the third option. Right? Anybody think of other options? Other questions we should ask?
I'm sure you're going to do it anyway, but maybe don't ask about 32 bits, but 32 bytes.
Yeah, 32.
It's now a Freudian thing. All right. Okay. So let's start with go back to 32-byte EKM. If you support making that change, please hum now. All right, next question. If you support making no change other than a clarification, saying that this sort of is something you will need to, the protocol will need to revisit if it becomes necessary in the future, please hum now. All right. And the third option, make the breaking change to make the size of the EKM dependent on the size of the hash function. Please hum now. All right, that's pretty clear consensus to go back to 32-bit EKM. All right, 32-byte. So this is now a Freudian thing. It will never go away. All right. All right. Does anybody have issues, other issues that they want to bring up?
Quick clarification, the only thing there's to change based on what I just looked at is to delete a sentence. That
Fine.
delete one sentence that is actually arguably non-normative anyway. So.
Yeah.
So we're not saying that change. I don't think we're saying that change requires another last call. It would have been the changing it to match the PRF. Yeah.
All right. So anybody else got issues that we forgot to bring up that they just remembered, or not seeing anybody rush for the mics? And I think in that case, we're ready to do the following. If the authors could ship another revision of their document with all of these issues addressed, including editorial nits that we have discussed on the list. And at that point, we'll ship it upstairs and hope for the best. All right. Agenda.
Revisit. Let's see.
Yeah. Well, no, we already did that. Yeah. So we got 2 items on our agenda left. One is the 0RTT, and Nick, if Nick is in the room. Yes. And let's see if I can dig up those slides.
That looks like it. Okay. So I'm going to review the changes in this draft from the 00 draft version, and there were also some discussion points raised on the mailing list to cover. So I added some more language to the security considerations about the proof of possession or lack thereof, and I'll go into more details of what we do or don't get with the proof of possession with 0RTT token binding. Also, I changed the client to switch from 0RTT exporter to the normal exporter during the connection to satisfy some concerns about using 0RTT exporter, and also clarified that when we use the ZeroRTT exporter, there is a token binding extension with that. It's just an indicator extension, zero length data, to indicate to the server which exporter is being used so that the server does not have to do trial verification of that signature. So on to the next slide. This is an overview of what a client malware attack could look like in TB Proto. So you have the attacker on the left here, does a TLS connection to a server. The attacker uses their access to the client machine in the center to generate a signature of that EKM, and then sends the token binding with that signature over the connection from the attacker to the server with the bound token stolen from the client. The key point here is that once the connection between the attacker and the client has been severed, the attacker cannot create any new connections to the server. So the proof of possession in normal token binding is that the whoever sent the token binding message had possession of the private key, was able to do a private key operation at the time the connection was established. So next slide. This is what it looks like in ZeroRTT. The attacker can make several TLS connections to the server and get new session tickets that can be used for ZeroRTT. Then it can forward requests to the client and generate token binding signatures for future connections using this new session ticket. At a later point in time, the attacker can now initiate a TLS connection, a ZeroRTT connection, in that early data include the token binding signature over the early exporter, and all of this can be pre-computed without any input from the server. So this is why sometimes the wording is there is a lack of proof of possession, because after the attacker loses access to the client machine, as long as it has a new session ticket that was still valid and went through the stance previously, it can send a token binding signature that is still valid. By valid, I mean it, the server can verify it. So there's this sort of lifetime concern of up to 7 days. Let's see. And next slide. This is just outlining a different possible attack that can be done. You still have the sort of 7-day or new session ticket lifetime concern here. In this case, it is the attacker actually replaying the token binding message and client hello from a previous connection. In practice, this one is probably less likely to be workable just because it needs to replay that exact message, and the server is hopefully going to enforce some amount of lifetime on the ticket age, which will be a shorter time period. So that's sort of the overview on the sort of proof of possession concerns on here. I think even with the sort of 7-day time frame, this sort of form of token binding that has these security concerns is still something that is valuable. It is especially valuable on the use cases where sort of client malware is not the main threat model that's being considered. For example, protecting OAuth tokens from XSS, there's no client malware involved in there, so only the ZeroRTT replay case that is covered in the TLS 1.3 spec is a concern, and past that, ZeroRTT token binding is sort of a similar security perspective. So next slide. So in terms of which exporter to use, there have sort of been 3 ideas floated out. The original proposed idea was always use the ZeroRTT exporter. Another idea was require that the ZeroRTT exporter is only used in early data. In practice, this is not really implementable. Basically, when a client starts preparing a request, there's going to be some time delta between when it starts preparing that request to when it sends it on the wire. And sort of in the diagram I've sketched out here for request C, it starts preparing that request before the early exporter, or before the normal exporter is available, but then sends it after that's available. So having this hard limit adds a lot of complexity to the server. This also creates issues with fragmentation of the TLS stack could decide that it needs to fragment request for whatever reason. Could be something related to the 1n-1 split for CBC IV randomization, or it could exceed the maximum TLS record size if it's, say, a large post request. There's several reasons that fragmentation could cause an issue here. And then if a token binding message gets split across records and pre and post handshake, then I don't think anyone has any explanation for what that means. So this mechanism for having the client change the exporter as soon as possible, I think, is more reasonable. As soon as possible is kind of vague language, but essentially what I mean here is a client sends some request, maybe sends it with the early exporter. The server doesn't like that it used the early exporter for whatever reason. It says, this is not secure enough for me. I want to see this with the normal exporter, and sends back a response that says, please try again with the full exporter. By the time the client receives that response from the server, the handshake will be far enough that that exporter is there, and then the client can try again with the full exporter. Yes.
Sorry, Adam Langley Google. What is that signal to say, please try again with the full?
Yes, that's a good point. So TLS 1.3 doesn't have any mechanism to say, I didn't like what you sent in early data after it has accepted the early data. So this would have to be an application-specific signal. For HTTP, this signal could be a 307 redirect to keep the method the same, and redirect to the same location with possibly an added query parameter to say that it performed this redirect. So such a mechanism could be hacked together. It's not the most elegant of mechanisms.
Langer.
Yep.
So why is this different from, for instance, a server allowing a 0RT exporter for some amount of time and then expiring that later?
This is basically the same thing as this is sort of codifying the client rules of when to switch. There isn't a sort of time-based thing on here, nor is there a ratchet mechanism explicitly indicated. Mm-hmm. So one could imagine that the timing of two requests is that the client starts both of those requests at the same time and then sort of flips the order in which it sends them on the wire and ends up sending one with the early exporter right after one with the full exporter. So
right, I'm just suggesting on the server side, you allow both for some amount of time, and you say like, hey, this is possible that one request was sent over 0RTT and another one was sent over 1RTT, just they're close to each other with the exporter, but then later you ratchet on the server side like after a certain amount of time.
Yeah, that sounds like it could be a reasonable thing for a server implementation to do. I don't have any sort of hard rules of the server can be guaranteed at this point in time that it is safe to do that. But in practice, that will probably work out fine.
So what is the security consequence of accepting that request with the early exporter and the token binding and the, say, an access token that's going to give that requester access to some information under the early exporter? Or are you proposing that request just be thrown away because it doesn't meet the security requirements?
So I think I heard two questions in there. What is like sort of the security difference if the server accepts a token with the early exporter? And then the second one is what should the server do if it receives a request with the early exporter but doesn't like it?
Well, yeah, I guess if it doesn't like it, I guess we would have to explain that there are different security properties of these, the spirit of these 0RTT requests to whatever's being the resource server or authorization server or client, etc. Sounds like, so first the question is, what is the difference? Is there a meaningful difference in the security properties that would cause one to be vulnerable to meaningful attacks by accepting the 0RTT data?
So I think that that first question, I think, gets back to the proof of possession concerns on the previous slide, which is that if the server is concerned about either client malware attack or is trying to think if the zero RTT replay from TLS 1.3 is potentially a concern. Then that would be a reason why the server might decide that it doesn't like it, because the proof of possession is weaker in that case.
So the API from the TLS or from the token binding stack would have to expose to the application that this was a zero RTT token bound token ID, and good luck with it.
That could be an option for a server.
Yep.
So Andrei Popov, Microsoft. So on the first question, I do think that the token binding with zero RTT creates replayable tokens in a way, right? So they can be either replayed directly with the same message, or as was shown again in the attacks. So all of those attacks with token replay become possible if you do zero RTT. So I do believe that it involves a degradation of security in a way, and it takes away some of the guarantees of the token binding protocol that we have. My second point is that trying to ratchet up from the early EKM to the proper EKM with proper proof of possession is a pretty complicated mechanism as currently defined. But I also think that once the server has accepted a weakly bound token from zero RTT, the horse is kind of out of the barn. So trying to secure it after that is a little bit. So I'm just not convinced that the complexity is worth it.
Okay.
Like either you accept zero RTT token binding and you are willing to deal with it, or you don't. This is where I'm living.
If you go to the next slide, I can make an argument for why the change to the draft of switching exporters should actually just stay where we were earlier of always using the zero RTT exporter. The argument is roughly as follows, that if a server is accepting token binding and zero RTT on the same connection, then it is fine with the security properties of the zero RTT exporter for at least some of the requests that server can process. If the server receives that same request post handshake, it can it's fine with if it still gets the zero RTT exporter with that, because it was fine receiving it pre handshake with the zero RTT exporter. So that request can have the zero RTT exporter at any point. And then the next part of this argument is that a TLS 1.3 server cannot reject early data based on the contents of the early data. It needs to decide whether to accept that before looking at it. Otherwise, there can be a deadlock scenario in the handshake. So the server, in deciding I'm going to accept some early data, basically is saying I am going to accept all early data. I'll accept any request that I receive in early data. And then via the previous steps, we're fine taking the early exporter with it.
Ben Kaduk, well, now that you went through this slide, it seems like a fine opportunity for me to say that, at least for me, having seen this slide, that's sort of saying it's an argument for the server to not accept zero RTT data at all. But that's not actually what I got here to say, which is more along the lines of with the zero RTT data, there's sort of two general cases that could be considered. And one of them is in like a well-behaved client that's using PSKs from session tickets, and it's only using the session ticket once, and it's only using the client hello once. And in that sort of case, when you do actually go through and complete the full TLS handshake, that sort of retroactively confirms the zero RTT data because the client is well behaved. It's only going to send it once. And so, okay.
I thought that's how I got up here, and then I decided that was not true.
And then the other case is sort of when the client is not well behaved, or when you're using an external PSK, and you really don't have any sort of guarantee about that at all. And I'm not sure that we're really thinking about this case for all of the discussions we're having, and certainly for some of the text in the document.
Sure, I've definitely been ignoring the sort of pure PSK case.
So Ecker is here to tell me why I'm wrong.
Well, or you can tell me why I'm wrong, so you understand there. So my understanding is the security property you're attempting to obtain is that I can't bootstrap temporary access to the token, to the signing key on the client's device into a permanent forgery, right? That's at least part of the principles. I temporarily controlled the client's device and I signed a bunch of crap, and then I lose access, right?
Yeah.
And so What the problem is, the reason it doesn't retroactively bless the zero-RTT data is that ordinarily the signature includes the server's anti-replay knots, and now this does not. And so the mere fact, so I can basically make as many tokens as I want, and then I can, and then because I can complete the handshake with the server, it's only the TLS anti-replay you have. It's not the anti-replay from the token binding signature. And so when I got up, I was going to say what you said, and then I realized halfway through that I think that's not true because there's one RTT token binding covers that server anti-replay token. Yeah. So you get anti-replay at that level, even though you're right to say that for the TLS data alone, the one RTT handshake does retroactively confirmed on a replay.
So I think Ben is correct in that completing the TLS 1.3 handshake retroactively blesses the application data,
yes,
but it does not retroactively bless the exporter signature used for token.
That's what I was trying to say.
Yes, I think I agree with you. And so then the only sort of potential chance of protection that you have is the reuse of the ticket, because when the bad actor has access to the key material and it's signing all this random stuff.
So yeah. Even anti-replay on that doesn't help. So the scenario on slide 4 shows that the attacker generates its own new session tickets to use. So it's never replaying a new session ticket. It is just using the own ones that it's generated and using the client as an oracle to sign to use after the fact.
Yeah, I mean, my impression is essentially no matter what cryptographic construct you use, unless it includes data from the server or you have some other strong anti-replay, you can't solve this problem.
I think we're sort of stuck with this sort of 7-day or whatever the age of the new session ticket time window is for the proof of possession for the zero-RTT key.
Andrei Popov, Microsoft, which brings me to my second point that I wanted to point out, which is, if the working group is willing to consider using token binding in zero-RTT with all that we've described so far, I would like to have a mechanism for the client and the server independently to have a way to avoid doing this. So like so that I can build a client that never does zero-RTT token binding, but still can do zero-RTT with some servers and token binding with some servers. That's basically something we need to design into this solution if we are to go ahead with this.
Yeah. So. I think I had mentioned this on the mailing list. An original proposal for doing this is that basically in terms of how the processing rules work for the token binding extension on zero-RTT, it would be that if a client it does not want to do the combination of zero-RTT and token binding, if it has a zero-RTT new session ticket that it could use for a server that's done token binding with in the past, it doesn't do zero-RTT, and that's fine. The sort of complication gets into a server that does zero-RTT, doesn't do token binding, and now is doing both. And looks like Edgar has a question.
Well, not a question, but a suggestion. We went to all the trouble of minting all these extension points into new session ticket, and when you could simply mint an extension point that said, "I will do zero-RTT token binding." So it opts you in rather than out.
Yeah, so putting that extension in the new session ticket from the server allows the server to do sort of either token binding or zero-RTT, but not both. I don't think this helps in the case of a server that is willing to do both, but a client that is not willing to do both.
No. So sorry. So what I was so let me think about this for a second. I think you may need both, but if as I understand it, the server is willing to say, so you don't want the server to be able to say that I will do. That I will do zero-RTT, but I don't want to do token binding with zero-RTT?
So right now, if we want a server to do either token binding or zero-RTT, but not both, it can do that very easily by looking at the client hello. It sees both extensions and picks whichever one it wants and
fair enough.
The other.
Yeah.
The complication, though, is a client that wants to support zero-RTT with servers that do not do token binding and token binding with servers that do support it, but still interoperate with a server that supports what I'm proposing without having to do this spec. And that would rely on the server implementing some parts of negotiation correctly, which for a client to rely on, that sounds a little washy. I think a better mechanism would be to propose another TLS extension, just an indicator extension that says, the client says, I support doing token binding over 0RTT, and the server echoes that back if it supports it. And sounds like something that could also be put in the new session ticket, maybe just as a reminder.
Yeah, that's what I thought Ucker was saying, was that you have a new extension that says, I'm willing to do 0RTT with token binding together, and it goes in the client hello or the new session ticket, depending on which party supports it.
Okay, so the case to think through is a client has a new session ticket from a server that is valid for 0RTT, but at that time that server did not do token binding and now wants to do token binding, or now the server supports token binding and it wants to not do both of it. So if this flag isn't there in the new session ticket, the client is still safe to put token binding in its client hello, and because that extension isn't in the new session ticket, the server will not assume that it's doing this newfangled thing, and it will assume that it's just.
I think that's the idea. But this seems intricate enough. We should sit down with a piece of paper and like try to work through the details.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I would really like it if this were opt-in and not.
Yep. That is certainly my intention, to make this combination be opt-in for both of them. So yes, I will continue either offline here or on the mailing list or both with those details for that. I think I have 2 more slides on here. So in the spec right now is this replay protection TLS extension, sort of the idea of let's make sure that a server won't accept the same new session ticket twice. I think based on the discussion of the threat model and the attacks that an attacker can do that don't involve actually replaying a new session ticket, I don't think this is useful, so I'd like to remove this.
Yes, please do so.
Okay.
The attacks that you described, we defend against them however we defend against them, and we don't need to do any extra signaling in order to do most of those things. If you need the signaling, you can stuff things in session tickets and other places.
Okay, so I think this extension will be gone in the next draft. The next slide. Okay. Next slide. So upcoming changes. So this first bullet point was fixing up some language around changing exporters. Sounds like based on, I would like to get a better sense of the consensus of should we stick with switching exporters, in which case this is a language fix since I got the language wrong, or should we just go back to doing 0RTT exporter for the whole time? And oh yeah, and then the other one was clarifying about what basically the processing rules are in 0RTT for the token binding extension. Yeah, that was the last slide.
Do you want us to poll the room?
Yeah, so for the first point about sort of either sticking with the early exporter for the whole connection versus switching the exporter, it would be nice to poll the room and also leave an option of let's think about this more.
Okay, so there will be 2 options. One is changing the.
Sorry, could I just, Adam Langley, could I just butt in before we do the poll?
Sure.
You had a point where you said, well, a server might want to send a 300 something to say, please try again with the full exporter. Yes. And then you had a slide arguing why the 0RTT exporter was fine forever. Yes. But that argument didn't convince me that the case where the server might want the full exporter is invalid. Did you expect this argument to destroy that previous suggestion?
Yeah, so this the question was whether this argument destroys the thing about server sending a 307 to say, please use the full exporter. I think what it this argument does not sort of destroy the 307 argument. This argument is sort of looking at this ignoring what the application protocol is and assuming that TLS gives us no mechanism for a server after accepting early data to basically reject the early data. The 307 argument is an argument that says with HTTP, we do have this mechanism to sort of reject and ask it for new response later.
So there's always a danger of sort of building complexity out of the fear that somebody may need something. Do we have concrete cases? I'm looking sort of at Dirk and maybe somewhere Cloudflare there. Do we have concrete cases where servers would want to 300 requests if they got it on a zero RTT exporter? All right. Cool. Thank you.
And I think some of that might be not knowing the answer, which is why I think having a third option of let's think about this more sounds reasonable for the poll.
I just had a quick question about the intuition behind the client malware model, where, so is the idea there that your token key would be in a place on the client machine that's not accessible by malware, but does have an API to sign with it?
Yes, so the idea is that the key on the malware might be like sort of backed by some hardware module, okay, but there is some API for signing it that the browser or whatever client software has access to, which the client malware can run at the same privileges as that software. So similarly has access to do signing operations with private key.
And is this the model that browsers are using to implement this?
I think it depends on who you ask.
Andrei Popov, Microsoft. Definitely this depends on who you ask. In IE and Edge, we use stronger protections for the token binding key than for the cookies. So malware that can access the cookies cannot necessarily get access to the token binding key. So, but they do have the access to sign because the application process is supposed to sign. So yeah.
The sort of Chrome view of that is that like if you have malware that can read the cookies on the disk, you can read the token binding keys on disk, and we're not really trying to protect against that.
So it's about Iyengar. I just wanted to ask for a quick clarification. By always using a zero RTT exporter, do you mean by that even if you have access to the one RTT exporter, you will use a zero RTT exporter?
Yes. So I mean, on a connection where zero RTT data is accepted by the server and token binding is negotiated, then the zero RTT exporter will be used for the whole connection. If zero RTT data is rejected on the connection or not attempted at all, then you'd still use the normal exporter.
So my question is that why isn't there a third option, which is that if you have access to one RTT exporter, use the one RTT exporter. If you have access to zero, use a zero. But the server can choose how long it is actually valid for, like the zero RTT exporter, how long it's valid for. So for example, instead of sending it 307, the server could implicitly use its RTT calculation estimate to say like, hey, I expected one RTT. This should have come in, the one RTT exporter request should have come in by now.
That sounds very similar to the current language of switching exporters. It adds a complication of the server is now, I think, sending some signal to the client that says only use the one RTT exporter from here on out. It does allow the server to...
No, I'm not suggesting an explicit signal at all. I'm suggesting just that the server ratchets, tries zero RTT, one RTT, both on a HTTP message that it gets. So it tries to validate against zero RTT exporter, it tries to validate against one RTT exporter. And then after some amount of time, it says like, sorry, zero RTT exporter not valid anymore. Like, go away. Like if there's an error, it sends a 307, which it can do anyway. It doesn't need like token binding support for that. So it can do this in any case.
Yeah. I think that's roughly what we have here. I don't know if we would need extra language to say that a server can do that. I think that's sort of in the sort of adds complexity space for it.
I'm saying that like it's an argument against saying that always use zero RTT exporter. If there's like that's a third option, right? So if we're humming on fourth option, sorry. I mean, if we're humming on options, then why isn't that an option to choose from?
I think that option is sufficiently similar to the existing option.
Okay, we're going to run out of time for Brian. Okay. So I think that we proved that we don't actually have any kind of consensus. That further conversation about this on the list would be useful because, as I had a sense, not everybody is... I don't know that we can actually formulate binary things on at least the first one about switching exporters. Was there another one that you wanted us to do?
There was another one on the last slide, slide 9. And this was clarifying language around negotiation. So I think that's just an editorial point.
Okay, can you do that on the list? Thank you very
Yep.
much.
Okay, thank you.
And our next guest participant will be.
I got the marquee spot, huh? Last with 10 minutes ago.
No, you shouldn't mark the spot.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Those are the wrong slides. Yeah.
I didn't reflect on the.
You can, or just bring your laptop off and we'll plug in because we're running short on time. Chris, do you have a video adapter? I don't know. I have an HDMI cable.
Somebody has like VGA to something that
Display port to VGA.
display port here.
Here, Brian, plug in.
Chicago is where we are. HTTPS token binding and TLS terminating reverse proxies. I'll go to the next slide. So the problem here, problem statement, is a lot of HTTPS applications are, I need to read my own notes. Can you go back? Oftentimes applications are deployed behind some kind of reverse proxy that actually does the TLS termination. For these applications to actually do all the kinds of things you'd want to do with token binding, something needs to be passed from the front end terminating TLS to the back end. In the general case anyway, there's a few things you could do differently, but sort of the general case of supporting this, you need to pass some information between the two. And in the absence of some standardized or documented way of doing this, everybody's going to do it differently. And this is bad for interoperability, for security, and opportunity to get things wrong. Just as an example, I've been recently working on mutual client TLS authentication and passing that between a front and a back end component, and everyone does it differently. And now we've implemented one product, and our other product has to do it differently than that one to match up with the way the first one did it, because it was based on a de facto implementation of how Apache did it. And it's a mess. And I'm looking to avoid that kind of mess for these kinds of things going forward with token binding, however that may be. And so next slide, please. In Seoul, we got to a consensus to work on the problem. That was as far as we got, because I didn't have a draft or anything, but I took that and ran with it, wrote up a 0.0 draft. And basically how this works is there's a new HTTP header introduced that's to be passed between the reverse proxy and the backend application called token binding context. It's a base 64 URL encoded byte sequence, and basically that byte sequence is a concatenation of the token binding protocol version that was negotiated, the token binding key parameters that was negotiated, which is just 1 byte, and the EKM value. This is a sufficient amount of information for the backend application to actually validate the token binding and the token binding header, the SEC token binding header, including the provided and referred. It requires some level of trust between the reverse proxy and the backend application, that they're not sending it to the wrong people or accepting an inbound from somebody else. And the reverse proxy also needs to sanitize this header so it can't be just spoofed and sent through from the the actual originating client. Quick example, it looks like that. You break it out, you've got the the version there, draft 13. This came from a live example. 2 is the DSAP256, and then the ECAM follows that. Next, please. And so in real life, someone actually implemented this already. They have it showing up here. The bottom one is the token binding context. This is a mod token binding plugin for Apache by a former colleague of mine, Hans. I think he is on the line, so thank you, Hans. He's got it working, which is nice. It's not too difficult. Next slide, please. But he and some others recently have raised some questions about whether this is really the right approach. And my goal really is to just have kind of one way of doing it. I'm not married to one or the other, but there's kind of two general ways to tackle this. One is the current one where the backend application validates the token binding message itself. And it does this by being provided this additional data context from the front end. This keeps the TTRP, the TLS terminated reverse proxy, relatively lightweight. It doesn't have to do any extra cryptographic work on the token binding header. It doesn't have to parse the HTTP header, pull it apart, which is, I think, a goal that many have stated either explicitly or implicitly for this, is to keep that layer as light as possible. I think at even one point, Dirk, you said that Google's implementation does validate the token binding at the front end, and that in retrospect, you might consider doing that different. Is that still true? Yeah, maybe. Okay. So that's the kind of the main goal here. It does introduce maybe some problems reconciling and updating supported key parameter types. If you have a lot of different applications behind one reverse proxy and you want to add a new key parameter type, all those different applications have to be able to support it in order to make this work. And it might make that both the management of it and rolling out new ones rather difficult. It also potentially is, what feels like a lot of redundancy in trying to make all these different backend applications capable of processing and validating the token binding header, which is arguably a little bit difficult. The alternative approach at some level would be to have the reverse proxy validate the token binding and pass back some information about it, either the token binding IDs itself, the whole message, maybe the hash of the message, I'm not sure exactly, but something basically where the work happens on the front end and some sort of digested version of the token bindings get passed back to the back end. This is way simpler for applications. I think it's a lot easier to deal with the supported key parameter types because they're all isolated at the front layer. You can upgrade that, everything works. You just pass the token binding back to the back end. The downside of it is it's definitely less light on the token, too many T's, excuse me, the TLS terminating reverse proxy. And that violates a goal that at least some have definitely said they're interested in. And I've had some people go so far as to say that the draft should describe how to do both, which I would really prefer to have just a single way of doing it, whatever it is, rather than both. But it's been thrown out there as a compromise of sorts. So the current draft is the first approach. The second one I think is totally valid. There's trade-offs between the two. Yeah. Is now a good time to, yeah.
Piotr Sikora, Google. I wanted just to reiterate what you just said, that the second approach is much cleaner to application and that we shouldn't push the complex logic of verification of token binding to each application and just keep it at the proxy. Thank you.
So we're running out of time, so we'll cut the line. What did you say, just before or after, Tony? Okay. Okay, just
before Tony.
Okay. We could hum on that. Okay, just after Tony.
Was that your last slide?
Not quite, but.
So I'm not particularly fussed about whether or not who does the parsing and validation, but I am fussed about the fact that if the proxy fails to strip these properly, then you have a really, really serious problem. And so as I said in an email, I really think it'd be nice if the proxy had to use some cryptographic mechanism, had some cryptographic binding to this value, so that the client could not generate a value which would pass through the proxy and be acceptable with the application. Max signature, XOR with a random value, stuff in a random value, something.
So your points were actually on the next slide.
Oh, okay.
At least to raise discussion. I'm not sure we're going to have time.
I don't think we do.
Yeah, I agree. We don't have time. So the Justin Richer, and so I'm in favor of the first approach of sort of doing the calculation and passing it back to the applications, because that allows the applications to do sort of the full processing of these things and figuring out what they want to do with that information and whatnot. And I would also like to point out that this does not preclude the gateway from also doing validation of the TLS token binding if it wants to dig into the messages and all of that stuff as well. The question then is, what can it then pass back to the backend system to say that, yes, I also did this? And this is where I think that what was just brought up by Eric was a really good point, that if the gateway, if the terminator is doing something, then the client sitting behind it should have some indication that that really did come from the terminator. We see the exact same problem at the application layer with API gateways and all sorts of other messy things that people are, you're absolutely right in your intro, people are going to deploy these things anyway. So we should give people the tools to do this correctly. So I would like to see something that mixes in keying material from the gateway or something like that in generating this to prevent injection attacks and lots of other things that we're already seeing in other similar spaces.
So the injection attack, though, is mitigated by sanitizing the headers. And while there are other ways of dealing with it, if they're properly done, it's done. If there's other ways of dealing with it, it introduces...
Guys, we are out of time. And so, Tony, last word. And then I suggest you use the, find time, go in a huddle somewhere and spec this out.
Tony Nadlin, we've implemented this different ways within Microsoft. And one of the issues that we have is this doesn't work on untrusted endpoints very well at all. So that's a use case that just this thing doesn't work. We're also not seeing any real need for the interoperability aspects of this. Mainly what we're doing is talking to our own back ends, and we want to be able to do what we want to do our own way, and sometimes we have validation on either side of this thing. So we don't want to be locked into this particular situation here.
Okay, so can you mark Tony down as against interoperability?
All right, that's it for today. Thanks everyone for turning up. See you all next time.
I was going to say, this doesn't lock you into anything. This is about open source and vendor products implemented so they can work together.
Right.
Yeah, but I think so. Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, it was the chair screw up with the slides.
I don't care. I was going to go to Curdle, but yeah, well, Kathleen will be in office anyway, so you get to pick.
In that case,
I think Curdle will probably end early anyway.
I need a cookie now.